Good morning. Welcome to Victory by Faith Fellowship, our Sunday school hour. We're glad to have you joining us this morning as Russ is about to bring our Sunday school for us, and we're excited about that. And we just want to say that, wherever you're joining us from, we're glad you're here today and ask you to, stop by and drop us a comment. You can do it either on Facebook or YouTube where you're at. Or you can go to our website at vbff.org, and there's a comment box down at the bottom of the front page, and you can go there and drop us a comment, drop us a prayer request or praise report, and let us know what we can be in prayer for you about. And that's why we're here. So, let us know so we can be praying for you. And so at this time, Russ is going to come and bring us our Sunday school.
Hello. For those of you that have been watching these past few weeks, you know that the unit that we're talking about is mentoring, investing in others. If this is your first time in a long time, the meaning of this unit is about the relationship that we have with those around us. Because one of the most important words in the English language is the word relationships. All of life is about relationships. Our relationship to God and our relationship with others. How we live is determined by our relationships. Whether we negatively or positively impact others through ourselves is the most important thing that we do in life. We are created in God's image for a relationship with God. Well, we are also created to be in a relationship with each other. Nothing in life is more crucial than being a part of a relationship with others, to be able to help others, to be able to just be with others. Every follower of Christ is called on to mentor or disciple others, helping them grow in wisdom and maturity. Mentoring occurs in any number of contexts, within the family, the church, the workplace, the school setting, and any place we meet with others. This 6-session study this unit focuses on 6 different mentoring relationships seen in the Bible. And I would like to challenge you that as you go about this week, get involved in helping others develop their spiritual walk. We will be discovering valuable principles to guide us as we invest time and energy in the lives of others. Last week we spoke about Eli and Samuel. This week we'll be speaking about Mordecai and Esther. The point of today's lesson is to encourage others to follow God's leadership no matter the cost. Following Christ and being obedient to Him is not always easy, and the growing antipathy the world feels towards Christians adds to that challenge. Christians stand better when we stand together. When we take the opportunity to mentor someone, our presence, words, and example can be a great benefit and encouragement as they live for Christ in an antagonistic world. Our passage this morning comes from the book of Esther, chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, as well as chapter 4, verses 8 through 17. The book of Esther takes place during a time when the people of God were in exile because of their sin. It specifically tells the story of God's people in Persia, modern-day Iran. While God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther is a story of God's providential care for His people. He cared for them and sustained them even while they were in exile. And that's one of the things that happens as we live our spiritual walk. It's that there's times when we fail and we feel like we're in exile from God's presence. We feel like we're alone. But even when we feel like that, God still cares for us. He still sustains us. Eventually we'll realize that God was there the whole time, and it's only us that makes it seem like we're distant. It's important that we realize that before we go too depressed or too far into our mistakes and to get caught up. Like last lesson was, to not let past mistakes prevent you from being an effective mentor. It's important that we continue on with what God calls for us to do, because He's there the whole time. All we need to do is to turn to Him. That brings us to our first question. What is something you are willing to do that others might consider risky? Now, a little more than a year ago, I decided that I wanted to read the Bible all the way through just once, because I hadn't done so before. And I ended up reading the Bible like throughout for at least 2 months throughout the whole school year, right throughout the day of the school. And so I was in school and I was reading, and I personally didn't feel that was risky, but my father would tell me many times later that doing that, like when he was in school, would like make people bully you, just encounter, like you would encounter negativity from doing that. Thankfully, I'm blessed with good height, so nobody was really going against me, and that was amazing, but it could be considered risky. In this antagonistic world, being a follower of Jesus Christ is not always welcome. It is crucial that believers stand together for Christ, that we be there for one another when other people would be against us. Let us pray as we get ready to open the study up. Dear God, I ask that for everybody that believes in you, Lord, for the courage to stand up for you when the time calls, that they be able to, that the words come to them, Lord, as you said they would, that as we are challenged, as we are confronted for our faith, that we all are able to just stand firm, knowing that you are for us, so nobody can be against us. I pray that you lighten their burdens, Lord, that as they go through this next week, Lord, that they just feel a sense of peace, Lord, that you give them an extra scoop of wisdom to be able to get through the problems that they face. Amen. Amen. Let's open to Esther chapter 2, verse 5 through 7. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Now Esther chapter 2 verse 5 introduces a major character in the book of Esther, Mordecai. The name Mordecai was most likely derived from the name of the Babylonian god Marduk, and Marduk was the chief god of the Babylonians. The text clearly tells us, however, that Mordecai was Jewish, not a pagan Babylonian. The text doesn't tell us whether Mordecai was his Jewish name or was a name that was given to him as he was in Persia, but it doesn't really tell us. I would assume that it was a Persian name, but it just doesn't tell us a Jewish name. The first readers and hearers of this book would have understood that Mordecai was a man who had not forgotten his people, had been called by God to be a special people set apart for service to him and a blessing to all peoples. The names Jair and Shimei are not as familiar as the name Kish. There was a judge named Jair who had 30 sons and judged Israel for 22 years. The name Shimei refers to at least 14 different people in the Old Testament. One Shimei both cursed King David and sought his forgiveness, though in the end he was executed by Solomon for breaking his vow. The name Kish is one many Bible readers will surely recognize. Kish was the name of King Saul's father. Given the number of years that have passed between King Saul and Esther and the comment about Kish being taken into exile, the Kish mentioned here is surely not the same individual as King Saul's father. However, both men named Kish were said to be from the tribe of Benjamin. The tribe of Benjamin was the smallest of the tribes and was descended from the youngest son of Israel. Genesis chapter 49 verse 27 describes Benjamin as a wolf who tears and devours his prey, and in the end of the book of Joshua recounts a time when the tribe was nearly wiped out by the other tribes. It was only due to the Lord's compassion to his people that the tribe was not completely annihilated. The reason why they were going to be annihilated was because they had fallen into very bad sin. And the whole tribe of Benjamin, like the towns that they had allotted to them, were just full of sin to such a way that it was basically like Sodom and Gomorrah. And one man went into the town, and his attendant or his female servant was killed there because of it. And so all the tribes of Israel were aware of it, and they all teamed up to take out the Benjamites. And the tribe of Benjamin would have been lost if it wasn't because God had saved them, because there was the tribe of Israel. These two themes of courage and the Lord's compassion are seen throughout the book of Esther. And the thing about the book of Esther is that many books like Esther, like Jewel, are books that are not commonly known, like because of how small the book of Esther is, only 10 chapters. Many of them are overlooked. Esther's more common than more uncommon books in the Old Testament, but each book in the Old Testament is there for a reason. The thing is about the Bible is that it comes from the Jewish word biblos, which is translated as library. The Bible is therefore God's library, and each book is put in there by God, and each one has a lesson for us to learn. So next time you're reading the Bible, try to go to one of the more smaller books in the Old Testament. Like Obadiah literally only takes up one page. There's a lot of small, like really small books that they hold a lesson, and you just have to look for it, and it's there. And the thing is about the books of the Bible is that when you learn that lesson, you don't have to learn it yourself through your mistakes. In verse 6, it provides further historical context for the book of Esther. And there's more historical background can be found in various other Old Testament books. The historicity of this account means the book of Esther is not a parable, an allegory, or a fable that only provides moral lessons for how the people of God should conduct themselves. Instead, Esther is the true story of God's sustaining power and his covenant-keeping grace. The Lord did not abandon the people of Judah when they were in exile, but provided for them, even through the decisions of pagans who did not know him. The main character in the storyline of the book of Esther is God, though he is never named in the book. The true story of Esther is the historical background to the current Jewish festival of Purim, a celebration of hope and survival amidst difficulties. Hope is a major theme in the book of Esther. The first thing we learn about Mordecai's relationship with Esther is that he apparently was her legal guardian. The last part of this verse defines how the relationship came about. Secondly, we learn Mordecai was Esther's cousin. Later in the chapter, we learn Esther's biological father was named Abihail and was Mordecai's uncle. So we would say Esther was Mordecai's cousin on her father's side. However, Mordecai must have been old enough to be considered a suitable guardian for his younger cousin. The name Hadassah was Esther's Jewish name. This is the only mention of her Jewish name throughout the rest of the book. She is known by the name Esther. Hadassah means myrtle tree, and according to one ancient writer, is connected to the idea of mercy. The theological concept of mercy is the idea that God does not give us what we deserve. Right. For instance, God is merciful to us when we, as sinners, deserve condemnation. He sent his Son to die for our sins. God's mercy is seen throughout the book of Esther. Myrtle trees are mentioned in at least 3 other Old Testament books, being Nehemiah, Isaiah, and Zechariah. In each of those places, myrtle trees indicate hope that God is at work in the midst of difficult circumstances. Esther was her Persian name and is most likely derived from the name of the pagan goddess Ishtar, known for her beauty. As the text indicates, Esther was also known for her tremendous beauty. Another book in the Old Testament that recounts God's sustaining power through exile is the book of Daniel. In that book, the title character, Daniel, is given the pagan name Belteshazzar. However, by contrast, instead of using this pagan name, he is most frequently referred to as Daniel throughout the book. Both Esther and Daniel are examples of living faithfully. Amen. While we do not know how her parents died, Esther was an orphan. Mordecai's family situation is not mentioned, but his behavior demonstrates he was a man who sought to love God and others. God calls us by example and instruction to care for widows and orphans. And I was told a while ago by a chemistry teacher of mine that when you're raising somebody, it's important that you do what you want them to do. So like the teacher that told me this, he said that he wanted his child to be a reader, and so he would read constantly in front of his child. And I believe that also applies to our faith. If we want our child to be those who are mentoring to be to properly know Christ and to know the Christian values, we should demonstrate those values. We should demonstrate to them what living as a Christian means. And because we can't really properly demonstrate that if we're cursing or if we're doing things that are not, biblical. Mm-hmm. And the text mentioned 3 things about Esther. First, she was young. Second, she was fair. Third, she was beautiful. Traditionally, Esther is thought to have been a teenager, possibly as young as 14 years old. While this may seem scandalous to 21st century ears, we should also remember this was a different time and place, and cultural expectations about marriage were quite dissimilar from our contemporary views. We should also remember that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was probably about the same age when she married Joseph and gave birth to Jesus. In any case, Esther was a young woman, but she would not have been considered a child in that cultural context. Though, considering this cultural context, if we go back to the book of Genesis, when God was talking to Abraham, Abraham was like 80. And so if they usually have kids around 14, that truly demonstrates God's power when their doubt, really, when God told them, you're going to have a child now. Like you're 70 years past the point when people usually do so. So it's the power, like the magnificence of God was more easily seen back then than it is now, in that context.
Right.
Or in that point. There's many other points about that apply more now than then, but in that point it was more then and now. While the specific understanding of what constitutes beauty can vary from culture to culture, all cultures value beauty. While some cultures view thinness as beauty, other cultures view what we consider being overweight as a sign of beauty. We cannot know for sure what Esther looked like, but she was clearly an attractive woman in the eyes of her culture. Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. This text tells us explicitly about the exact relationship between Mordecai and Esther. He was not only her cousin, he was also her adopted father. Mordecai's relationship with Esther was affectionate and fatherly. This brings us to our second question. What are some ways family members can effectively mentor one another? Keep each other accountable. The people, especially when you're close to your family members, when they know your ups and downs, when you're struggling with something, tell them about it. Help them keep you accountable to God and to yourself about what you're doing. When you have someone that's able to tell you when you're slipping or tell you when you're messing up and you trust them, you're more easily able to accept that criticism and not be embittered or, angry about it. And when we're going through stuff, having someone that knows what we're going through, praying for us specifically about that issue helps. And be there for them when your family members are going through stuff. You don't even have to say anything, like a hug every once in a while, that helps. Look with me in the book of Esther, chapter 4, verse 8 through 14. And he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king, to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Attach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spake unto Attach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to this kingdom for such a time as this?
Amen.
Earlier in the book, in the first chapter, there was a queen called Vashti who had fallen out of favor with the king. And so the advisors had counseled him to go and find another one. And so but the search for the replacement queen concluded when Esther was made queen in Esther chapter 2 verse 17. She was chosen to be queen from among many other women. The king is said to have loved her above all the women. The fact God used a pagan king in a Jewish version to carry out his plan does not endorse paganism. It does stress that God's always at work, even in the lives and decisions of pagan kings. Mm-hmm. This reminds me of Exodus when God hardened the heart of the Pharaoh so that he could show his glory to the Israelites from what was about to happen. Right. He used the decisions of the Pharaoh to just demonstrate his authority to the Israelites. Recorded at the end of chapter 2 is an event in which Mordecai saved the Persian king by exposing a plot to kill him. Mordecai's actions in that case demonstrate the biblical command to obey earthly leaders and to seek the peace of the city wherever we find ourselves. Then in Esther chapter 3, a wicked man named Haman conspired to kill all the Jewish people living in the Persian Empire, which spread from India to Africa. Haman devised a scheme and persuaded the king to unwittingly sign off on it. Public notices have been distributed around the kingdom. Our study picks up the story of Esther and Mordecai there. Mordecai had learned about Haman's plans and sought his cousin and daughter's help in foiling those vile plans. Attach was I don't exactly know how to say this word, but eunuch, it's like eunuch. Attach was a eunuch who worked for Queen Esther. Eunuchs were castrated males employed by the king, who worked with queens, princesses, concubines, and other females. Esther had sent him to Mordecai when she had heard her uncle, along with the Jewish people, was fasting, weeping, and laminating in sackcloth and ashes about the decree. In verses 6 through 7, Mordecai communicated to Esther that all that was being planned for the Jews. Mordecai even provided Esther with written proof of what was being planned. Mordecai had a plan of his own. He wanted Queen Esther to appeal to the king on behalf of the Jews, even though she had not yet revealed to the king that she was herself Jewish. Up until this point, Mordecai had told her not to reveal her ethnicity. Now the circumstance had taken a dramatic turn, and he commanded Esther to intervene, even at the risk of revealing her ethnicity, in order to save the people of Israel. The fact Hathach had to declare it onto her could be an indication Mordecai did not think Esther would understand the importance of what this decree meant, or possibly that Esther was not literate and could not read the document for herself. Either or. Having learned that Mordecai was her adopted father in chapter 2, the fact Hathach was able to charge Esther to take this action makes more sense. As a good Jewish woman, she would know that, according to the 5th commandment, she was to honor her father and mother. Her initial response, however, was not of a dutiful daughter, but one of fear. Hathach, though not a Jew, became an important tool in the plans of God. Hathach's king had consented with the orders that the Jews were to be destroyed. In keeping with the theme throughout the book, however, this pagan eunuch would do his part in carrying out God's plan. He faithfully communicated Mordecai's plan to Esther, even though it challenged the decree of his king. Throughout the Bible and history of the world, God works through pagans and non-believers, in addition to his own people, to accomplish his purposes. The theological concept reflected in this truth is called God's providence. In verse 10, Esther spoke unto Hathach and gave him commandment to take her response to Mordecai. The same Hebrew word used in verse 8 of Mordecai's authoritative communication to Esther is used here of her communication to Hathach. This kind of demonstrates the authority that a father has or a mother has over their children in the Jewish community, to be able to have the same authority that, or use the same language that a queen would use to her servant, or someone with power to use to their servant, and have a father say the same thing to his daughter is pretty important in a society like that. Right. Esther declared, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. The law Esther referenced here about not approaching the king was probably in place to avoid assassination attempts, and was not unreasonable. One cannot walk into the Oval Office and expect to have a meeting with the president. While it is true Esther was the queen, the king may still have feared being ambushed by people he knew. In that time frame and area, assassinations were sometimes carried out by people close to the king. Esther's initial response was not full of faith, it was full of fear. Instead of obeying Mordecai, Esther hid behind the rules, regulations, and laws of the land. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. Esther did not say she was refusing to do what Mordecai commanded. Instead, she quoted the rules and facts to Mordecai. It is not clear why she had not seen the king in a month. It's possible that the author of the text is reminding us of how Vashti had fallen out of favor with the king early in the book. Whatever the case, Esther was not immediately following Mordecai's instruction, and he would hold her accountable. We can often try to hide behind circumstances in order to avoid God's clear call on our lives. We need mentors in our lives who will challenge us to do what is right, godly, Christ-like, and full of faith instead of full of fear.
Amen.
Esther's servant carried her response to Mordecai, but Mordecai would not be deterred by Queen Esther's initial hesitancy. He knew he must hold her accountable for her actions. Mordecai sent word back to Esther, "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews." Mordecai warned Esther she would not be able to save herself by hiding behind rules. Our only real security is in Christ, and that security is eschatological. Whatever. In other words, while we may not remain physically safe when we choose to follow Christ, we remain spiritually and ultimately safe. And that reminds me of a verse from Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both the soul and body in hell."
Right.
When we're called to do something, even if it is at risk of bodily harm or even death, it's important that we do so, because our time on this earth is fleeting. It's but a small time compared to the eternity that is ahead. So doing what God calls us to do is really just, even if we die because of it, doesn't mean much when we die we go to paradise. The reward is there. All we need to do is follow what God tells us to do. To be strong in faith. Being strong in faith, kind of like Mordecai, whose faith was strong, he knew God would save the people of Israel. Thus he declared, "If thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Mordecai was confident God would keep his promises to bless the whole world through the Jewish people. His reply to Esther was clear and concise. God's plans would not be thwarted. Esther's participation would not determine the fate of God's people. However, Esther's response would determine the fate of her and her father's family.
Right.
Esther's decision would not be ultimately determinative. God had already determined he would bless the Jewish people and would bless the whole world through them. This reminds me of the argument where God doesn't need us, and that is the truth, but he wants us.
Right.
God decides what he's going to do, and if we help him or not doesn't change what's going to happen. Us helping them benefits us, but God already decided that what we're going to do what he wants us to do is already going to happen. Deciding that we're going to do it, trusting in God to take care of us, to trust God with our lives is, the biggest. Jesus said that the highest form of love for one another is to lay down one's life. And God calls us to do that sometimes, but we must trust that that is God's will. Being prayerful about it would help, I suppose. Praying about if you are in that circumstances. I don't know if you are or not, of course, but if God calls you to do something that can get you in jail, can get you to do something, first check the word to make sure that it aligns with God's word. Amen. Second, if it is true, do it. Don't quote me on that. Mordecai provides Esther with written proof of what was being planned for the Jews. There was proof for what was happening. It wasn't just one man's word. There was proof. And that's something that we also need to know, is that going out on a limb is something that we do in faith, but having actual truth and physical evidence of it, which God will give us when we need it, is wise to have. This brings us to our third question. What obstacles can get in the way of us doing what is right? The people around us affect us. It says in Proverbs that if you surround yourself with fools, then you will become foolish. Right. But if you surround yourself with godly people, you will become godly. There's also a reel or an Instagram I saw the other day where it says if you surround yourselves with 5 rich people, you will be sixth. If you surround yourself with 5 foolish people, you will be sixth. And so the people that you surround yourself with determine what you gain. Mm-hmm. If you're surrounded by people who love God, follow his commands, read his word daily, you're going to pick up on that. Right. And it's being around saved people, being around people who follow God is a blessing. Amen. Though there is a point where you go out and you go preach to people, and sometimes you do hang out with people, but the purpose should always be to get them to know Christ, not to just go to parties, or not to have a reason that you think is right to go do things that aren't. And when we're called to do stuff, there's going to be obstacles in our way, but God has placed us in this world for such a time as this. No matter how high you are in like the social hierarchy, no matter how successful you are, God put you there for such a time as this. The reason why it's like, as Paul said, he's been in good places, he's been in bad places, but he can do all things through Christ who strengthens him. That brings us to our fourth question. When has God answered your prayers on someone else's behalf? Now, my father suffers from a skin problem that the doctors really don't know how to help. They have no idea what it is, and every once in a while it'll flare up really bad. And so me and my brother prayed for him, and it did go down. And that's one of the times that God answered my prayer, or our prayer. And so praying for people, especially for health, you may not hear the results immediately. And so it may seem like your prayer wasn't answered, but have faith. God's time is different from our time. His time is perfect. I was at a worship meeting on Friday, and somebody spoke about how the same person who was in the audience that night, one of the pastors, told that he prayed for that person a year before, and then that he met the person a year later at like a diner, and that person told him that he was healed. He heard about it a year later. He didn't know if God answered his prayer or not, but he did, and he only heard about it later. So pray, and pray. Doesn't matter if you don't see immediate results. God's time is perfect. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His ways are higher than our ways. Have faith. Look with me to the book of Esther, chapter 4, verse 15 through 17. Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye from me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai went his way, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Despite her initial hesitancy, Esther did not cower when Mordecai rebuked her and laid the situation out plainly before her. She also did not become embittered or angry. She calmly considered Mordecai's wisdom and replied to him using an intermediary. In her response, she requested Mordecai, Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye from me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. Prayer is not explicitly mentioned in this passage, but throughout Scripture it is tied to fasting. Amen. Esther understood the value and importance of corporate prayer and fasting. The Christian life is meant to be lived in community together. There are no Lone Ranger Christians in the Bible.
That's right.
That's the thing about, I think I talked about this before, but not the idea of not going to church because it's not necessarily required. It's kind of a foolish argument, because when you go to church, you meet people